Hello, everyone. This is Justin Cobb coming in from Arlington, Virginia. Welcome to another episode of Insight. I have a very special guest with me today. His name is Cristino Chavez. Cristino, thank you for coming on to the show today.
Oh no, thank you so much for having me here. And I think it's an interesting experience. So yes, I'm with the Legal Aid Society. I'm with the social work department. The one of the forensic social workers on site, and with other team of others. Um, and beforehand, much of my experience is involved in the criminal justice and social welfare area. I'm in the second year PhD student at Weiler School of Social Work here in New York City, and my focus is actually revolving around understanding the police practices and the juvenile justice system, and when it comes to how well and how much do we know about rights. Um, I've I would say for me, I like to get myself involved into a lot of things, so I hold several hats, and I think one thing about it is how I will say we're not these spaces are sometimes so over consumed by those in power that don't understand what it means to know the impacts of systemic oppression and how our carceral system, how laws have been designed to really put a hold on the progress of communities and kind of in a way like set that barrier for us to really become more to grow and become more progressive in the restorative aspect of what we assume the justice system is supposed to be for. Um, so I definitely is going into understanding like how for me I would say what I do now is more of an attachment to my passion in the work I do. um it's I would say I got my social work license from Adelphi University, my master's there, and just I would say much of it stemming from growing up. So I'm here in New York City. I currently live in the Bronx, and before that, much of my life I spent living on Long Island, Long Island born and raised, and uh, it's interesting when we talk about New York because everyone look when we think about New York, we think about New York City, and
Mhm.
of New York to be a very progressive state and a very opportunistic state. And it's in reality is that that focus is only in the South, in New York City, while the rest of this state itself does experience a lot of what we had back in the 1960s in the pre-civil rights era. So it's interesting, like it's a different shift in culture and dynamics and relationships. And growing up, for me being my parents are Central American. I'm a Salvadoran American born and raised here, but my parents aren't. And so the from the instance of how who I look and how I am and where I come from and my parents, etc., all of that had really made it interesting living in a community where it was already predisposed that I should be involved in the justice system. That was something that was going to come up in my life. That was
Mhm.
something that was expected to be because I this was like this is in a community where safety is a big thing, but also the perpetuation of who are those that perpetuate violence in these communities, and what is that expectation like? What does most of the communities think are committing those crimes?
Literally. And I am so grateful that you are bringing this up as well. Speaking as someone who used to go back and forth between Arlington, Virginia, and New York City, one, props to you. The Bronx is not an easy place. And I'm not just trying to talk about it in the stereotypical sense of how we understand the Bronx. There's some real things that happen in New York broadly, but in the Bronx. That no human should ever have to go through. So, like, mad respect for you, what you're doing. And on top of that, I keep telling people all the time, especially now that I've had this experience with New York. There's a reason why New York is called the Empire State. Let's put that out there for folks. Do you think it's a coincidence that New York is referred to as the Empire State? I don't. Empire is happening, and this is where a lot of it is taking place. It
Yeah.
is, it is with all the money that is being filtered in and out of New York. It's happening here.
It's insane because it's like going to another country and you bring up you're from the United States. The automatic picture that I've received from traveling and has been, oh, a Statue of Liberty, New York City, Times Square, and it's like no, and some folks may I like, bring up like they're from other states, and it's like that's when we think of the U.S. It's always been like New York City. It's always been just that life, and that's kind of because it's just like you said. I mean, um, living in the Bronx for me is very interesting because I love doing community work. For me, it's like there's always situations that are happening. I think the misconception that often comes up for folks that are, especially in boroughs like the Bronx, is that it's that idea of what we see on TV, what we see on social media, what we see on in movies, and what is portrayed on the news. I'd say much of my growth when it comes to understanding community organizing, understanding civic engagement stems from my experience here in the Bronx. So like living here, living on Long Island for me growing up, I didn't have that opportunity. If anything, because of the color of my skin, because of my being a first generation, and even for being a gay man, it was always this assumption that I'm not I could be brought to these meetings. I would be involved in committees and councils, but how much I would say power does my voice have? How much of an effect does the work that I'm doing have within a systemic change across the island? And so coming here, I'm coming across many groups and many events where community members, folks that just live on the block, are voicing out issues that they have. They're not afraid to share it. They're not afraid to bring it up, and that's kind of what inspired me to really get involved in this type of work. And it's always that perception that I mean, yes, you mentioned Empire State. If anything, I think about it like the Roman Empire, where it's like, okay, it grew big, and the next thing you know, crashing down, everything is just like gone. Because New York City, as we're here right now, of course, we have situations happening down in City Hall. It's all over the news. It's crazy because it's perpetuation that New York City is that grand city, but when you're inside of it, it's like the grass is never. There's not always green on the other side, and so it's like in that issue with rent. It's like looking at having to pay more to even survive and to live, and it's just insane. But it's always just the fact that that's something that we are continuously advocating for. Is we're pushing for opportunities and to really show that how things are going is not how it should be, and it should have never been that way.
One of the things I wanted to talk about too is the fact that you are a justice impacted individual. And this actually segues into a lot of your journey. And from the posts that I've seen from you on LinkedIn and the work that I've gotten to read about, a lot of this is centered in this experience. There, I know that this can be a hard topic for a lot of folks to talk about. So if whatever you're comfortable with divulging to audiences, can you walk me through this journey of how you became a justice impacted individual and how that shaped a lot of the work you're doing now?
No, of course. I think it's an interesting topic because, like you just mentioned, it's no one likes to talk about these experiences because one, it's considered like a taboo. If you have been justice impacted, whether directly or indirectly, it's always that stigma that, oh, you're kind of you're you can do all these things, but you've been involved, you were arrested, or you were charged, or you had a criminal record, or you spent time incarcerated. And right there, it almost gives a sense of this in a way a label, this idea that you're not a person. And so for me growing up, I was always aware of like pretty much, I would say, prior to, and I would say my experience started 10 years ago, um, when it all started. And this was actually when I was in college. uh, I used to always do a lot of work. I was a caseworker at the time, and I was working with folks who were just going through treatment court for mental health court in Long Island. And I was basically, my role was to help them understand the importance of taking medication. And sometimes I would go with them to court, and I would always ask myself, like, I don't understand like the experiences that they're going through, but I can only think I may not understand. It may not be something that's gonna. I thought at this time like it's not something that's gonna happen to me. Like, and of course in my and family wise, justice system is not something new. And so I always thought to myself like, and I think it's interesting because I brought this state. I was thinking about it once where when I had to go visit, make a visit to the correctional center, and I was asking myself, I wonder how it would feel to be in their shoes. Little did I know that that actually experience happened within the month before graduation, graduated with my bachelor's degree, and I was in the city. I was out with friends. I had a couple of drinks, and I got into a car. And in that moment, I was in a minor offender bender, but the officer was present, and because I was under the influence, I was arrested in New York City at the time. Had very stringent laws. I remember clearly that despite how I felt at the moment, I knowing that how the system works and how the system makes people feel, I already told myself like my life is over. Like I ruined it. I'm it's going downhill for me. I might as well just not go to school. Like I'm about to graduate, but now I can't graduate because I'm now in the system. And it was from the minute of an arrest to being held in a holding cell, but also seeing how people inside the cells were being treated.
Mhm.
I think what got me really nervous is that there are people that were there who were present because of technical violations and weren't being issued, but almost as though law enforcement didn't give a damn about that. It didn't really care about what you're here because you're here and you're a criminal. And so I got that essence when I was just in that environment, and it's just almost looking like get that sense of I had to spend a weekend there and I was able to come home. But I remember just seeing that look that they would give you when you're stepping out. And it's like, oh, you're like think smarter. And what for me at that time, and this was luckily I was able to go through this process, and luckily I only had the support of my parents, but also mostly my support from my defense attorney, who really worked with me because this is my first time ever getting in trouble. Um, I was already accepted into a master's program after graduation. I had to kind of prove to the judge because the judge already had this assumption that if I was going through the system like I don't think straight, that I don't have common sense in that sense. And I had to kind of prove my worth. I had to tell them like I'm going to school, I have a job, I'm doing this and that. This is the first time. I had to really show that this was something that was like I'm a person and that I'm learning from that, and I need the resources to help me grow. And luckily, I was able to do that. But one thing that came across for me that I didn't realize till years moving on was how traumatic it was for me. I think what I come to realize even to this day is that I can walk across the street, and if I see a police officer, even though I work in an environment full of officers that are present, whether it's me going with my clients to court to support them, it's like I still hold that sense of fear. Like my heart, when I used to, when I would drive around town or I was going to visit family, I would see officers driving behind. I would get nervous. My heart would pop out my chest. I would hyperventilate. I had to kind of play it cool, but it's almost like the suspicion that something will always happen. And so I really got myself, and what I realized in going into, I took a year off of between graduating with an undergrad and then starting a master's program, and then starting my MSW journey. I really wanted to just figure out a way how I could work with people who were also dealing with the justice system who have been arrested. I had this interest in the court system because it's a system that has been created, established to. I put this idea of law and order, but much of these choices, of course, when it comes to understanding justice, when we think of it to be very objective, is more so very subjective because although players in the game, like the judges that are meant to be non-biased and neutral in the
Mhm.
situation, there's always personal biases that exist within those that are either reinforcing the law or uh, uh, practicing law. And that right there was something that I always felt like we needed like do something. I wanted to do something about that. I took a social policy class as a requirement, and that right there opened me to understanding what want to do, what I need to do on a community level, because I could work with five people getting facing criminal charges and realize that there's a pattern that we're not recognizing or we're ignoring. And so that's kind of what pushed me to really just jump in opportunities. Like despite what I went through, and I will say I had the privilege to not have been incarcerated, and luckily I was able to receive a conditional discharge, which basically like under a year, if I didn't get in trouble, my charges would be sealed. And luckily that was what the case was. But it could have been completely worse. And I worked with people who don't have the access to education like I did, or didn't have the access to treatment or care. And that's where we are starting to realize, especially here in New York City, it's like you're having people enter the system. You have people going to jail. You have people getting arrested. And what is looked on paper as something as heinous as an assault can be. I've worked with young folks that may have had charges with assault. And because we see it on paper, we're seeing them as criminals. We give them that label automatically. But sitting and talking to them and listening to them and realizing that they're being charged with assault because they were victims of domestic violence with their partners were perhaps law enforcement, or their partners were are someone that they had to fight for their life, but because they are called and they are arrested, they had that charge. So it's always understanding the big picture of things, and that's kind of where I'm at now, with both on a practical level as a forensic social worker, but also a PhD student. It's really drawing that picture and helping us realize that we are far from criminal justice reform. We're more so putting band-aids on little major cuts that should be stitched up.
Mm. A lot of what I'm hearing is essentially we're putting like we have a very open wound right now in this country. And I loved what you mentioned too, is that when we talk about how judges and people in the legal profession are supposed to be non-biased, they're supposed to be thinking critically on how they can interpret and implement the law regardless of a person's background. But there's the ideal and this expectation where the reality falls short.
Yes.
And a lot of this of what you're hearing, what you're saying, and what I've been hearing through your answer, it this goes back to why the civil rights movement even took off to begin with in the United States. It's why the civil rights movement took off, and not just here, but anywhere that there is a presence of Western imperialism, because the law was not fairly implemented. And on top of that, the way it was built, when you have a jury of your peers, for instance, the reason why a lot of the civil rights movement took off was to even get people from these subjugated groups into the peer evaluative
Yeah.
process. We still see it to this day, where even now the civil rights movement did an amazing job actually getting it so that way we will all be considered when we go to courts in order to actually participate in that process. Be- there's still a discrepancy because again the legal profession is not inclusive in this
Yeah.
regard.
I mean, plus, if we look at it, we it reminds me a lot of when we celebrate the Proclamation, and that was signed. I think people from that moment somewhat assumed that slavery ended, and the reality is that it didn't end then. It we by their issues and understanding that slavery just modernized itself into what we call the prison system.
Mhm.
From abolishing slavery to turning and establishing the 13th Amendment and its understanding that you are free unless you are a criminal. And that right there was the vague term of criminal, because that's when we started to have black codes. That's when we started to have vagrancy laws, loitering laws. Like you were caught loitering, you could have been arrested and sentenced and become incarcerated, and you would have lost all your rights. And that kind of the remnants of that still exists today with those that are justice involved. That once they serve their time, they come out, and it's like now I can't vote, I can't get a loan or financial assistance to go to school, I can't get a job because I have a record on my a charge that happened probably 10 years ago that still affects me, and I can't. I basically have to do things that I shouldn't do to survive. And so in that era, and of course with the civil rights era, understanding the from Reconstruction, the Jim Crow to civil rights to now what we popularization of through mass incarceration, we are basically witnessing imperialism take its toll and capitalism take its toll on what we see here when prison systems are owned by private investors, and prisons are owned by private companies. That the more people you can lock up in here, the more we can be able to provide in funds. And it's more so the lobbyists that come into play, and it's where we see that we are looking for justice, but justice in the eyes of who? And when we talk about the people and protecting the people, who are those people that we're protecting? And who are we considering those to be the people?
Okay, so going off of what you were just saying too, because again, you mentioned that these are private prisons that are owned and people make profit off of this. These systems were built in a time period where people who were justice impacted were not considered human. And it goes back long before racial and ethnic minorities became the center of focus for this. A lot of this is colonialist ideology that was brought in from Europe. And I want to point this out to people that like what's happening over the a few hundred years in the Americas, in Africa, all these different places where Europeans have gone into and done this to folks. Europeans were doing this to themselves, like in Europe, centuries before any of this. The fact that we Europeans did not even see one another as human, let alone all these different folks who were different from them. It really goes back to a lot of what we we need to really go back and really understand like how did this happen, how did it get to this point, why did we allow it to get to this point? And every when I'm thinking about this, I keep thinking about how the amount of times that I've even engaged with police officers in any level, in any respect, and like because of what I look like, because of like associations with what it means to look like somebody like me. I keep thinking about how I have been afforded in many ways, I've been afforded the ability to just to be and exist. And then meanwhile, like there are so many other folks who go through a completely different experience when they encounter police officers, when they encounter legal experts. Like let's go ahead and segue into you come out of this experience and now you're trying to get yourself back on your feet. So can you walk me through like what that journey like for you? Because I mean, like you mentioned, and I mentioned, there's a stigma behind this. Like, what were some of the challenges that you faced in really like in this process of becoming again?
I think for me was doing a lot of mental health work
Mhm.
um, for myself, uh, going through the trauma behind it, but also ignoring the changes in how I felt. Because one thing about those that are involved in the justice system or legal system, per se, um, no one wakes up in the morning and says, "You know what? I'm going to drive a car into a building just for
Mhm.
the sake of it." Now, even that right there, that perception stems from many complications when it comes to mental health. Um, Prior to going through that experience, I dealt with a lot of depression. I dealt with a lot of anxiety. I myself dealing with the biases of religious trauma in my household, but also dealing with uh, having to, I would say, living most of my life in the closet, and so dealing with a lot of harassment and the pain that I had to kind of hide in and not show. Um, Ultimately, kind I would say, in that minute, that moment of when I did get arrested, and just basically being the ticking time bomb that blew, and then it's just like realizing that after that moment, how hard it was to merely uh, understand myself and understand what I was going through. Today, now, I mean, I still see I work with a psychiatric nurse practitioner, because I myself live with bipolar one disorder and ADHD. That
Mhm.
hasn't been something that was talked about growing up because in many communities, especially within the Latino community, I would say growing up and realizing that what you assume to be bad behavior, or you're just not, you can't sit down, you have to always like, you have to behave well. Reality was on a lot of undiagnosed conditions that ultimately had an effect growing up. And so going through that experience for me, I really had to tell myself like I need help. Like I need to go see somebody. I need to talk to somebody about it. I can't hide it. I can't sit here and pretend that yeah, it's something that's gonna be over with. Especially if I'm exposed to a lot of the outcomes or situations that draw that presence. And so seeing going for mental health care, getting mental health care and support was something that was a major part in my journey afterwards. It's just understanding what I'm doing for myself. Um, and also just for me knowing that, like I said, I had the privilege to say that I didn't go through long term incarceration, and that's something like it's not. I wouldn't say I wanted to be used as a competition because the legal system itself, all of around, is oppressive. Um, but I've learned to really listen to the voices of others that have gone through it as a form of and for me to be there as a form of support. If also anything, being able to use the privilege I have to advocate for change, because many people who do want to make a change, unfortunately, because of criminal records, don't have that right. If anything, cannot vote for these changes. And so that's where I see where I see myself being able to make that change, being able to do something as simple as here's providing a list of resources within the community that can help folks get help and if they can't afford it, to sitting and actually connecting with elected officials, asking like what is their idea of a safer community, and does safety and protection mean safety for all or safety for some?
Mhm. And that's the thing too, because we do need to highlight this as well. Like this, these discriminatory practices that we see in law and in justice, they don't just harm the people who it targets, it also harms the people that it's supposed to protect. I even think about my own experience when I was growing up in when started my academic journey in rural Pennsylvania communities. The police presence in these rural communities, it's evident, it is there. And unfortunately, there are some, like, here's the thing that I want to drive home for folks as well. Whether you are in a rural community, an urban community, or wherever, like, I'm not here to say I am against police. That is not my intention in this. What I am saying is that you have to have systems that hold police officers in check because even little instances can lead to bigger problems down the line if you don't address them. For my experience, I even remember just I was working at a fast food restaurant. I'm not gonna say who because I don't need them coming after me or whatever. But working for a fast food restaurant in rural Pennsylvania, I was walking home at night. I was working one of the late shifts. Did not get out of that shift until 11 o'clock at night. And thankfully, it was only like a 10-minute walk away from my house. But in the span of those 10 minutes, was stopped by police. And they were questioning me. I'm like in my uniform and I'm going home. I'm tired. I have like kitchen stains from food and anything that you can be encountering on my apron, on my clothes. And I'm just trying to go home.
Yeah,
This is what I mean. This presence impacts you. They're claiming to be here to protect you, but then you become under suspicion. We have to have the huger conversation about what this actually means.
yeah. I think it's that it's also we it's like we are in this era of, well, I would say in American culture and the Western culture and anything, we're very, I would say we follow this idea of individualism, where
Mhm.
it's like I'm not the one that does that. Um, so I don't know why we talk about it. When the reality is that it's not about whether you are doing it, and this is in regards to like law enforcement. It's you may be there are officers whose initial plan of going into law enforcement was to be that officer that could provide change and protection. And
Mhm,
often, unfortunately, the and I would say unfortunately that perpetuation of what folks want to go do and what they want to change within the system. Unfortunately, the system is not as it's not simple to change this a complex system that has been established initially as slave patrols
mhm,
officers after when during slavery. It wasn't. It's not something that's going to change overnight. If anything, the system oftentimes, and if anything, is responsible for changing the minds of those that enter.
mhm,
Those that are working for the system is understanding that there is a status quo. There are situations, there have been incidences on news of officers calling out the bias cultures that exist within their own departments, and it's almost understanding that in this era that where we are very defensive when it comes to addressing these issues, when
mhm,
reality is that we're not blaming anybody, but we're focusing on what is it that we actually have to change. Because at the end of the day, there's that idea, like for example, that was very prominent around Black Lives Matter movement is the defund the police concept, and there's the idea that the simple assumption that it was basically let's break down, we'll use all the money that goes to police enforcement, law enforcement to the communities. When the reality is that we are seeing huge budgets for law enforcement. And this is kind of like where, for me, is looking at the big picture in from big to small, and is realizing that we spend more money on our military and artillery equipment, from firearms to larger classes of law enforcement, when schools are still running on using textbooks from the early 2000s. Healthcare is impossible now because if unless you got $500 to go see your doctor, you're not going to be able to get the healthcare you need. To provide mental health providers now having caseloads of 60, 70 people because there's not that many opportunity or not that many people entering these fields and not that many resources available. So we're realizing that, and we're like seeing how dystopian
mhm,
our society is. We're realizing that we're really choosing things. We're kind of like almost like that ego boosting. We are tough. We're tough. We're strong. We overcome all. But when half of the like, if anything, 90% of the people behind us, or 10, even 99%, are trying to figure out a way to handle three jobs while trying to afford like I would say a rent.
mhm. Literally, the fact that we are literally working more now than ever before in any point in human history, and we are all being disenfranchised to an extent where you can't even enjoy the fruit of your labor. It it's so paramount to what is going on in this world, and
Yeah,
I want to be frank with folks too. Like, this is not just about like your race or your ethnicity, and it goes beyond gender. It goes beyond the social class even. This is about the human condition and how we have been structuring human societies since we start like from the beginning. Like the concept of caste, this idea that certain folks are more worthy than others, and therefore these folks can go through these experiences whereas these folks can't, is the heart of a lot of the issues that we are seeing. And a lot of it is connected not just in our social implications, it's also what's going on in our minds and our well-being as well. I loved how you tied your own struggles with mental health into this, and I feel like this is a key aspect for folks to understand as well too. Like, people who are just as impacted and the ones who are still in the system, they are human. Like, point blank. And a lot of them are, there's a lot of people in there who should not be in prison. And even if they were supposed to be in there, like, they still have their health issues too. They're still human. And let's also be frank, there are people who are not in prison. And if I'm not saying that prisons are the best way of addressing anything. This is up for debate and challenge, but here's the fact of the matter. We have prisons, and this is the system and the way it currently operates right now. There are people, based on today's guidelines and today's stipulations, who goes to prison and who does not, who should be in there, who are not in there.
They're they're probably getting they're probably right now walking into a restaurant to get
Mhm.
lunch. It's crazy. And that's the thing about it. Like um it reminds me of this French thinker. His name was Foucault, and he talks about birth of prison. And so this concept of when we look at critical theory and understanding critical analysis of our approach to the justice system, we're looking at punishment is the overall theme. Revenge is that idea that Western society, and if, like you said before, stemming from Europe initially, from feudalism and understanding how we had patriarchy as the main focus in when it comes to royalty in Europe, and how that basically went on to, of course, around the globe. But in this idea of punishment, it was we don't look at restoration, we look at revenge. And revenge over time from live practice torturing to and that was something that of course in the medieval times in Europe it was like that was kind of like the sports show. Like we're going to watch a game was watching torture happen. And it was crazy because that right there became desensitized. And that's what we saw transform from what was torture to punishment and revenge um, through now what we have incarceration. What we have is this embarrassment of you having to wear an ankle brace, a monitor, or you are home on under home arrest, is being seen as delinquent. And what we look at geography, or we're seeing that in certain communities, when you are have that label as delinquent, you automatically assume that that's what you are. But reality is that that was a label placed on you so that you don't see yourself anywhere but that label.
I have relatives who are justice impacted. And this is the thing I want to drive home for people too. It is not just BIPOC folks who are justice impacted. There are white folks from rural communities, communities who notoriously voted for Trump and Reagan and all these other conservative folks who
Don't get
are justice
yeah,
impacted. If anything, it's some of these rural communities experience higher rates of incarceration than urban communities. So it's wild.
it's crazy. I'm like, in just a short period of time within the 1900s, you like from the Nixon, the Reagan, the Clinton era, like these administrations, even till now, is it's like each administration, it's kind of shown us that um that we have been so complicit to this concept of moderate. It's almost like it's not the from Dr. Martin Luther King mentioning that it's not the KKK that we're concerned about. It's the white moderate, where it's like the sense of law and order is what we are noticing to be the priority as opposed to justice. And law and order, like I said, it's like it's such a subjective term because what folks think is law and order is actually trauma and abuse for others. What folks may see as what we need to correct up, like it's like we still have folks nowadays in law enforcement that believe that you need to go to jail so that you can get help. But the reality is that the jail is going to be the reason why you end up having to return over and over again because we're still using methods like solitary confinement for mental health. Those are victims of mental health disorders. You have people that have spent hours, days, in weeks. We have examples like Khalif Browder, who unfortunately, after his release, dealing with solitary confinement and abuse from not just those who were within, but also law enforcement that were also monitoring locations inside Rikers. Unfortunately, because of the severity of the abuse that he experienced, unfortunately ended his life. And the picture right there shows that these systems are like where we are basically trying to hold this sense of power when it comes to groups. When reality is that that's already been something that's emphasized since the first boat that landed on this coast.
Wasn't it, if I'm not mistaken, I could be wrong there, don't quote me on this, but I remember reading and hearing about it from some place that some of the first buildings that were constructed when Europeans came from Europe were prisons. Don't quote me on it. I
Well,
could be wrong.
prison's interesting because yeah, we had cells, and oftentimes like we look at examples like there were actually certain models of ways that prisons should be practiced. So you had like we have I believe the first one of the first prisons in I want to say Pennsylvania actually, where we had the idea that those we wanted free labor, so we are going to and it might be the opposite around because aside from that was the model that New York there was a prison in New York that had where it was like solitary confinement and you're only going out when you have to work and then going back to solitary confinement as opposed to you are and you're having to make money that way and then others that are basically you're not making any money but you're working and so we had that idea overall concept of free labor and that's kind of what we're using now with a lot of products that you see on the market and a lot of things that you see in the stores and a lot of things that are going that are supplying the military when it comes to warfare it's being done by free labor and it's the crazy part is that
Mhm.
we like to it's almost like the sense of we are in a state of performative action where it's like we
Mhm.
talk about justice, but we're basically living off the back off the work of justice involved individual of legal involved individuals working for free.
I'm glad you brought that up too, because California, take notes. This is how you not do it. Using prisoners to fight wildfires.
Yeah, I when I saw that, I was basically in my head. I'm just like it actually ties back to what just recently happened. I want to say in Tampa, there was a prison complex that when Hurricane Milton hit
Mhm.
touched land. Prior to that, you've had I think there was another incident where another hurricane hit where those that were incarcerated ended up dying and drowning because they officers all dipped. They all left. They did their thing, but you had prisoners inside these cells, basically trapped and not being able to get out. And so we are seeing that unless you're good for labor, you're not good at all.
Mhm.
And it's but bring it back. It's like it's almost like the sense that some of these people are in here that are wrongfully convicted. And if anything, you have many people that are incarcerated that are incarcerated for false convictions, for someone said a lie, and now I'm facing 25 to life. If anything, we've had instances like the execution by Missouri State for Marcellus Williams, who unfortunately wasn't innocent of a crime that he did not commit. And unfortunately, even from prosecutors mentioning that he wasn't guilty, still and was still had his life taken by the state. And what we have recently, I believe, and I have to actually see how that is because there is this there's a man that it lives with, I believe, autism that exactly right at this moment is experienced. It may be may be executed by their state and for a wrongful conviction. So we're seeing that it's not about justice. It's about revenge. It's about this idea that you don't mess with us because we are a tough place. We enforce the law because you don't mess with the law. Idea.
Mhm. Rest in power, Khalifa. Rest in power. We're doing this work and for you and so other people don't have to go through what you did. Like for real. And the fact that it's still happening to so many folks who are in there now. I want to, if we can, I want to explore this with you because you also meant we've talked about this already, but you are a member of the LGBTQ community. And speaking from my own experience engaging folks on these matters, I feel like there's definitely a lot of, how do I want to phrase this? It's more than just disagreement. There's a lot of controversy within like this understanding of LGBTQ experience in relationship to the prison industrial complex. Speaking as someone who was never incarcerated, but again, I told you my encounter with that police officer. I also told you about how about like like family members I know and love who have been who were caught up in this. Like is like for those of us who have some sort of experience and encounter with this versus like other people who may not, I don't want to necessarily blame these folks because It is a bias, and on top of that, it is like this is literally what apartheid does. It prevents a lot of people from seeing the reality of what is going on outside of their bubble. But what has been your experience engaging a lot of LGBTQ folks about these topics?
It's interesting because I remember doing my like in my social work program. I did my final year of my field placement in a juvenile detention center, and it was I think it was a very eye opening experience for me. It's something that I even look back today to owe gratitude of all the learning I got from that. And one thing about that was understanding the dynamics between straight and LGBTQ folks within the justice system. Those are going through juvenile justice systems specifically, um, and working with both youth that are going to the juvenile justice system and adults going through the criminal justice system. The it was always a sensitive, quiet, taboo, discreet conversation. Working with men that are victims of sexual assault, they always will come out saying, "I'm not gay," and it's like we're not saying that. But I understand the traumas that you've experienced by being sexually assaulted, especially at a young age, that's led you to perhaps not healing appropriately, and not getting the care and support you needed at that time, which ultimately may have been a factor as to why you are in jail today. We have a lot of folks that are afraid to come out because they are afraid of what can happen to them if they once they are once that is exposed. There are counts of sexual assaults that occur in prisons. There are individuals that unfortunately are within these systems, are diagnosed or may have be exposed to sexually transmitted diseases and other conditions like HIV and AIDS. And so it's like there, and because of the taboo, the fear, the shame that comes behind that, because the conditioning of what is supposed to be systemically appropriate in terms of like the heteronormative concept of what life is supposed to be is what you have to follow. But reality is that there are many people who are afraid to share their identities. When I was working with youth, one thing that came across that was interesting to me is as simple as those who for trans women coming into the system and trans men coming into the system, and um, that it for them it was I have to hide I had to stay strong. I worked with many that were charged with assault because they were caught in a fight because someone made fun of them or someone was abusing them, and that was the only way that they could protect themselves. And going into the court system where judges and officers and prosecutors use their dead names and use their gender of birth as opposed to addressing them as how they feel comfortable being addressed. And I remember talking to a child that was basically tired of everything. They already knew that, oh, you're gonna call me by my name, and it's like, what are your pronouns? And just that question itself was like, hold up, no one ever asked me this, or I haven't been told this before. And you could just see that change in that affect. Like I feel like now you see me as what I want to be seen as, and it's interesting because the system doesn't just put this sense of correction. It tries to shape you into what they think you should be and how you should look.
Mhm. Well, it really is a reflection of what's going on in the broader culture. This is a systemic way that the culture uses in order to maintain itself. Even look at what happens. I'm not just going to talk about the LGBTQ community in this, but in our everyday actions, regardless of our identities. How is it that we've created a culture in society? I know how, but I'm posing that question out there for the audience so they can start thinking if they haven't about it. How is it that we've created a culture where we're always policing each other, regardless of our categories, our titles, and labels, and saying, okay, are you like me like this? Why, like, instead of just honoring our humanity, regardless of what they are, why is it that we always have to say, oh, are you straight enough, gay enough? Are you like passing? Do you have like the passing privilege? How well are you masking? How well are you conducting yourself? Like all of
Uh,
this. And don't get me wrong, we need to hold people accountable for good behavior, bad behavior, in between behaviors. But this sense of if you don't fit within this form and you're this automatic a sense of, okay, now you're not a member of our community, is honestly the root of a lot of the issues we are seeing and how this systemic inequality takes place.
It's just so as it it's something that always gets me. It's like how, as simple as it sounds, how complex it's been made to almost feel as though it's irreversible, to almost feel like it's not possible to change. That's how it is supposed to be, and because that's how it feels, it's almost that idea that that is what is the norm. The values and ideologies that we hold as across, especially in this hemisphere, like I mentioned earlier, is like this concept of individualism. We have a lot of it. We have this sense of patriotism, nationalism. We have this extremity of what is right and what is wrong. There's
Mhm.
this perpetuation that we know what's right. This country is established to know what is the right way to do things. That once we somehow like over time, and it's like since the Revolutionary War, that idea that we're patriots, that we are stemming for liberty. But what is liberty and what is justice for all? What is this perpetuation of prosperity, pursuit of happiness? Like what is that? It doesn't. Like, and for what we are come to know, like since revolution, like the only people who were able to really do anything were white men, white
Mhm.
cis
Yeah.
hetero men. Women couldn't even do anything, and so even that situation has led to a lot of this perspective of who. How things should be, what things should look like, what to practice, what to follow, how to do things, what is allowed. We kind of have this idea what we live in liberty, but do we really live in liberty? Do we really have this sense of freedom here?
And it's very evident too with how international policy and procedure is being carried out outside of the US, outside of the UK, or whatever government you happen to be falling under jurisdiction of. But also, even today, I saw on the news about how Kamala Harris is struggling in the US presidential race because of her history
Yeah.
with the criminal justice system.
Yeah, and it's like the sense of we will come to this idea now that democracy, and of course with the Democratic Party, it's like this idea that we are is seen as progressive, but the reality is that we are a moderate state. We are in a very centrist concept of what law and order is. Like I said before, it's not about how for those who are, and I would say for my views, is very democratic socialist and understanding that that we there is no sense of liberty, there is no sense of justice if we don't have an understanding of what systems have done in the past and what they continue to do now. But because we had this idea of being moderate, being like we want to reinforce the sense of freedom and opportunity, but we need you to get your stuff together, pull yourself in the bootstraps, because if I had to, I don't know, if I had to pay to go to school, why should I pay for you to go to school for free? And it's that
Mhm.
idea that although we are, like I said, it's almost like reminding me of New York. It's like we have all these opportunities, but the system still hold people that fall under it and are marginalized or identified as one of those marginalized communities under this, I would say, this box, this idea that this is where you are and this is where you're going to be and this is where you're going to be stuck in, because you have to really push yourself out. And the reality is that we're not going to give you the opportunity to push yourself out. We want you to stay there.
Mhm. I wanted to take a moment, if we can, because all these hoops and hurdles that you yourself went through, and now that you can have this like thoughtful, well-rounded conversation about because you didn't just went through it, you took the time to understand what it is that you went through. Not everybody goes through that process. Not everyone just turns around and I don't blame them, but not everyone goes around and says, "Oh, hey, I went through that circumstance. I'm gonna study it, and I'm gonna use this knowledge to help do things differently and better." What was the moment for you that helped you say, like, "I got to do this"?
Um, I would say a lot of it stems from those I've worked with, who have who are just as affected or and returning from long-term incarceration, they had the opportunity to be incarcerated and be a part of pilot programs, educational pilot programs, to learn more. To once they released, are now working as doctors, are lawyers, are civil rights activists, are holding PhDs. They are leaders in their communities, and that's something that always inspired me because despite reminding myself that the minute that I was arrested, it was like my life is over. And then learning that it's not over of anything, I understand now where I can go and what I can do, is what I see as it was an inspiration for me to even take on that route and push myself to move forward. I was always someone growing up that was like, I always wanted to do a lot of things. I was trying to find ways to be active in something, and it was always like that idea, like, oh, you're doing too much for yourself. In reality, it was like, uh, I would assume another response, like maybe supporting me in that, but I've come to realize that, like I said, growing up in an environment that was in a very conservative area, in a very, I guess, status quo setting, it was always for me to assume that I wasn't really fit or expected to fit that achievement or go beyond what I can go. And for me, seeing folks that were just as well, working with folks that were able to get degrees while they were incarcerated, seeing folks in listening to stories now where it's like people who have been arrested, people who are and are passing law bar exams, or people that have families and loved ones that are incarcerated that pop up to rallies to or are protesting against these systems. It's something that I feel like it's like a true calling. Find my way to be a part, because like I said, the system's always changing. It might not even be in my lifetime, but or our lifetimes, but it could be. It's something that's possible if we continue to acknowledge the fact that what we're seeing now is an open shift in understanding how systems work, which is like you mentioned earlier about Kamala's current position in campaigning. It's yes, that's the reality, is that we can't accept that we can't hide the fact that there are people who are looking back into archives, are looking back into records, are looking back into history, are learning about this stuff. This is not like we're talking about being ignorant to the realities of what administrations are responsible for or people in power hold. We are becoming more exposed to it and more open to it, and that's something that, like I said, aside from what got me into doing this type of work, is something that I hope that students that I teach as an adjunct, like and communities that I work with and youth I work with, is that they understand that they are more than it's more than just a headline. Look at and do the research, understand what's happening, and be okay to feel uncomfortable. Because if you're too comfortable, you're not going to learn.
Amen. Amen. Actually get to know and talk with people who may you'd be surprised, even within individual families, folks, even within individual families. I'm speaking from personal experience on this. The amount of disagreement, even in one family, that can exist there. I know that we all
Yeah.
know that those conversations may be
Corner.
happening at the table. I'm going to challenge everyone. If you are going to be spending time with the holidays, don't be afraid to have those tough conversations with your family members. You don't have to try and convince them to think differently. You're probably not going to convince them to think differently. But at least to have the courage to say that you do think differently about whatever that topic happens to be about, because that is the only way that people are going to realize that not everyone is in the same boat as them.
Yep, I think so. That's exactly it. I think that's where it's like it's being able to have that, but also sometimes I think, like I said, we are in this era where we don't like to be wrong, and I think that's the one thing that hinders up from us being able to learn more. Okay, to be wrong, like I'm never right all 100%, so I do what I can to learn about what is right or what is accurate. It's taking a moment to sit there and say, like, we have been consumed to focusing. I mean, for me personally, it's like I love everyone around me. Whether it's family, but I have my own mind. When I later, if it's like I'm the one that's going to be buried 6 feet under, I'm by myself. I can ask myself, what did I do for me? And that's something where we kind of have to learn more about is understanding what do you feel works for you, not the values that you may hold or what your generations have passed down to you, but what do you feel is what you find to be correct or what do you find to be just.
Make sure that you can look at yourself in the mirror when you go to bed at night and when you wake up in the morning. Make sure that you can live with yourself and the choices that you made. And nobody is perfect. We are all going to make mistakes. We are all going to say and do things that we shouldn't have, but we are still worthy of love regardless. And if you can acknowledge the fact that you have done wrong, you are one step closer to getting it right.
Yep. Yep. Exactly that.
Mhm. There is a level of power that comes in owning who you are, not just in terms of what your categories are, but in your own possibilities. Like honoring your sense of humanity is going to be one step closer to actually creating the changes we need to see in this world. Christine, I'd love to like I've had such an amazing conversation with you today, and I feel like I would have to bring you on because we need like not just your voice but other voices like
Yeah.
yours. I'm so grateful you were here to share your story with us.
No, I honestly will say it's these are moments where I feel like are I try to put my like little seeds at times, and
Mhm.
sometimes just that I find it to be like more like more fruitful than one would expect. And I think that just giving the opportunity, and thank you again for inviting me to come and sit, because sometimes these are conversations that first thing I say, it's gonna be like, hold up, let's talk about something different. But the reality is that we're having these open opportunities to talk about it. We're talking about it, we're saying it, people are going to listen. And that is what is important, is that you take in what is being mentioned. We take it and we look at it through an open ears, open mindset, and understanding that we are all here trying to work together. And I think that just being here today kind of and sharing that, I'm hoping that for those who are just as impacted, for those who are dealing with identity or experiencing issues like these crises where it's questioning one's identity or figuring out what they want to do, or if they have like the potential that they have and understanding that potential. I think I'm hoping that everyone's like, hearing that and listening, that you're not going to be stuck in that position forever.
Mm,
If you pick yourself, if you pick look at yourself and pick your head up, and you realize that that's just one part of your life in that one chapter, and as opposed to the multiple chapters that you are not opening yet.
mhm. Carry your head on high, folks. You are worthy regardless. Yes. Christina, if people want to collaborate with you, work with you in any given sense of the word, what's the best way for people to do that?
I definitely have a Instagram page. It is at CNC underscore LMSW. And actually, in December, there is going to be a launch. I'm one of the co-authors for the third volume series of Latinx E in social work. It is more so a personal narrative of different social workers within the Latinx community, and how we got to be where it is. And I was able to have the opportunity and the privilege to write in my story, and that's something that it's on my social media page, and of course, my LinkedIn page is one thing that I also like to use a lot more than I've used to. So LinkedIn, Instagram, and email. I'm always open to connecting and collaborating.
I love it. Keep doing the good work that you're doing, Christina. I know on those days it could be like, oh, why even bother? But little things like this, small things add up, folks. They matter. Keep showing up on the small things, and the big things are going to come together too. But Thank you for coming on, Cristino. It's been fun. We're definitely gonna stay in touch.
Definitely.
Audience members, thank you for tuning in. This has been Cristino's perspective. Be sure to stay tuned for more insights. Hey everyone, that was an amazing conversation with Cristino that I had, and I am so grateful that you, as my audience, have chosen to listen and watch this conversation. It means the world. If you enjoy the content, if you are deriving meaning from what is being discussed, be sure to click that like button and subscribe to this channel, and be sure to stay tuned for more insights. We got more of it coming.